Okay, we'll go ahead and start our third and final presentation. If you missed earlier, the fourth, we have no video for the fourth, nor do we have a co-author, and so we'll end this session early. And I would like to remind you that if you have more questions for the authors, that they'll be glad to visit with you later on. So Soil Allies for International Development, blending agroecological research with innovative community outreach. I've read the abstract. This is an interesting topic to me. I'm interested to see how what you have to say about this, Adam. So.
Yeah, and maybe you'll have to bear with me because at the end I'll get more into the kinds of scholarship that you all are familiar with. I want to acknowledge Dr. Edwards, who many of you may know, as my co-author on this, and really one of the reasons I'm here. We can go forward on my first slide. These are some of the other reasons I'm here. I currently work for Dr. Lane's Soul Food Web School, which is an online school teaching producers around the world about ways to regenerate their soil health, essentially. I also, until recently, was at Oklahoma State University, and NIFA is a major reason that I'm here because they gave me the money to come here. So, yeah, we can go forward. I want to start with this man, Dr. Borlaug. I'm generally a big fan, right? And I'm not going to talk too much dirt about the Green Revolution, but I think it's important that we recognize that most things have unintended consequences. If you could go forward to my next slide. This is an FAO map of some soil degradation around the world. Many of the countries that are most constrained to feed and nourish their populations today are suffering from soil degradation, soil loss, erosion. And Green Revolution technologies sometimes contribute to that, in all honesty. And I'm not setting that up because I want to have a fight with anybody. I'm just mentioning that there's some biological reality there. Next slide, please. And there's a famous quote by one of our former presidents. During the Dust Bowl, he recognized the nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. So I dream of a symbiotic relationship arising between some of the different paradigms that are operating in agricultural development spaces, and especially at our land-grant universities. So often, the agribusiness model, or what one might call the Green Revolution model, is seen as incompatible with some of the alternative models, regenerative ag, agroecology, some of those spaces. And I spent 15 years walking through these different communities, friends with the hippies and friends with the Oklahoma ranchers, right? And so I believe, a lot of why I'm here today is that I believe that you social scientists in the room can help us find this messy middle. I'm not saying that middle ground is always an average of what is happening here. I'm saying it's a mosaic. And what we need to do is identify the effective strategies, especially when we talk about international development, right? Agriculture in a rural setting around the world. A lot of times the agribusiness model is not appropriate, but sometimes the agroecology models need to step up and prove themselves a little bit more, right? Especially in terms of profit. So please, let's collaborate on this, essentially. Okay. This is where it all started for me. Coming over onto to your realm is Rogers theory. I took a course with Dr. Edwards almost a decade ago, Dr. Edwards, and learned about these different adopter categories. And so if we have something, if we discover something in alternative agriculture, how does it diffuse into the mainstream? A great example of this for me is reduced tillage in agriculture, which is in general one of the most positive things to come to more of the mainstream. But it really came from an alternative agriculture space originally to reduce tillage. And so in many ways, we on our, I don't want to say side, but within the paradigm of, say, regenerative agriculture, we're also facing this problem of the chasm. So we've talked to a lot of the innovators and the early adopters across the world. We've got them to try what we're doing. How then do we go mainstream? How do we appeal to, I don't know if you want to call them more traditional food paradigms, but this is a question I ask myself almost every day. How do we cross that chasm? I think this word that's coming up in all the spaces is a word that can unify us, resilience. We want resilient communities, we want resilient soils, we want resilient food systems. The global pandemic has proven that our supply chains are not resilient as a human society in so many ways. The situation in Ukraine right now shows us that much of our agroecosystem is reliant on inputs that are not really resilient because they come from such a few sources. So one philosophy that's out there in the literature that I'm surprised hasn't actually gotten more attention is called Econutrition. And it explains, especially in a development context, how agriculture and the environment and human nutrition relate to each other, and why so often we see a vicious cycle where there's a reduction of soil health because of agricultural practices that not only degrade the environment on the farm, but the environment around the community, right? Because there's a hunger season and people will poach wildlife and they'll cut down forests because they need to make those ends meet in their lives. So you end up with this overall yield decline or reduction in the natural resource base, leading to nutritional deficiency, additional nutritional deficiency in a community, and then there's this feedback because children live malnourished in those kinds of communities, and they have less capacity to change their agricultural practices through time, right? That next generation has less ability, so they're stuck in a cycle. The positive is if we can get in there with improved agricultural practices, we can regenerate soil health, we can take pressure off of those local environmental situations, we can actually see yield gain, and I would mention here, like I asked with the coffee, quality gain in the food, so that there's a nutritional surplus in the community and potentially a generation of children raised who have an increased capacity compared to their parents to go on to another cycle of improving agricultural practices. So to put this, to give you a short biology lesson, I promise not to bore you, I did a lot of research here in the tallgrass prairie of Kansas when I was in grad school, and I actually took this picture of the bison that we have there, and I had this biological question of why is this system so resilient and so productive with very little human input? Right? For generations, indigenous people managed the landscape maybe with some fire occasionally, but there wasn't a lot of fertilizers going into this, and yet these are some of the most productive grasslands in the world. 40 to 60 million bison were supported by this ecosystem historically. How does that happen? Well, next slide, please. In my new job, I'm learning all about how it's the soil food web. It's this complex series of interactions between plants and their associated fungi and bacteria. There's protozoa in there, which are barely ever covered in the scientific literature, despite their importance. There's nematodes, there's arthropods, and this is actually very simplified. If I put up the real soil food web, none of us would understand it, right? So I want to hone in today on what I studied in grad school, which was mycorrhizal fungi. And I like to call them the tiny allies. They're like the flagship to me of all the mutualisms in nature. So these are specifically arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, which I'll call AM fungi. Now, just to orient you to what they do, they associate directly with plants. Most of our crops, most of our grasses in pasture systems associate with AM fungi. And they actually connect into the roots. It's like coral. There's no difference between the two species after they interlock. We call them a holobiont, right? A community organism. And they extend the reach of that root system so that the plant can access more water and nutrients in the soil. And forms of nutrients that plants can't normally access can be gathered by the mycorrhizal fungi. The plant trades some of its carbon that it's getting from photosynthesis with the fungi. That network grows, and it actually ends up enhancing the soil structure. So when your agronomy teacher talked about tilth, right, aeration of the soil, these directly entangle soil particles so that we end up with more quality in the soil. And historically, if you looked at something like the tallgrass prairie, they represented about half of the microbial biomass in that system, right? They're incredibly important. If we had just a teacup full of tallgrass prairie soil here today, and I stretched out those fungal structures called hyphae. We could go across 30 football fields, end to end, if I put those microscopic little filaments together. Unfortunately, as I found when studying some farm soils in Zambia a number of years ago, we have been going in the wrong direction, and you cannot see that. I hope you'll go read my paper. Maybe cite it too. But over here, that dot that's on the high end is a local grassland soil that I looked at as kind of a control, sort of a baseline of where the AM fungal biomass should be. And regardless of if we're talking about high input agriculture or agroforestry systems or conservation agriculture systems, the soils had all had about half of that initial biomass. So we're losing out on the opportunity to entangle and improve that soil. Thank you. Next slide, please. Another research project I'd like to mention, I used grain sorghum. That's sorghum bicolor is the scientific name. And we worked with the USDA on this, and actually had a group of extensionists from Africa say, hey, sometimes we get these sorghums from the US and they're not appropriate for our farmers. They can't fertilize them enough. They can't irrigate them enough to actually get them to produce the way it would in the US. So we compared those modern varieties back with some land races. And the take-home message there on this next slide is that the mycorrhizal relationships had actually been reduced in those modern varieties. We probably, because we've bred in the context of so much fertilizer, we've made the plants lazier. They're not investing in this relationship as much. Something is decoupling here. But those varieties that had more effective mycorrhizal relationships in lower nutrient soils, we could see 30% more protein, zinc, and iron in the grain. We went all the way to grain quality with this, as well as an increase in yield. Now, on the opposite side of that, we worked with a breeder at Oklahoma State that worked that was doing work with switchgrass, and that's a biofuel crop, or that's something that was being examined as a biofuel crop. And he intentionally was doing the opposite. He was not over-fertilizing the switchgrass. He was trying to make it hardier, more thrifty, right? And so we can actually compare the mycorrhizal responses between the older cultivars and his new cultivars. And we have a data point, or a formula that we can use to assess this, because I grew these plants without mycorrhizal fungi and the same soils and the same genotypes with mycorrhizal fungi. So I could compare the growth of the different genotypes. And the summary of that is that the new varieties that he had bred this way, sometimes they were producing 15,000 to 2,500% more biomass compared to their non-mycorrhizal partners. And the phosphorus in the tissue, we can actually see sometimes up to 9,000% more phosphorus in the tissue because of this mycorrhizal relationship. So, I want to take it back to a more holistic, large picture. What I have learned about the soil food web from Dr. Elaine Ingham is that it's a holistic and scientific approach that can really influence not just the ecosystem, like in terms of which microbes are there, but the soil environment of the farm, how we manage our food production systems. These can be brought together and synthesized, and through proper extension work, that can be spread, that can be disseminated, right? It's not just about finding the cool science, it's about deploying that science in the world. And so we're in Greece, and I've got an archway here. The soil food web, to me, the thing I'll fight with any other agronomist about is, it's the keystone. If we're missing it, we can't have a system that's holding up over time. We can't achieve sustainability. But what we need to do, one slide back, is arrive at these participatory solutions. What's been called the co-creation of knowledge, where we bring these communities together, and social scientists like you help us bridge these divides so that the technical experts are also in the room with farmers and having these discussions. And then I just wanted to bring up Dr. Navarro's work. I had a chance to speak with her at AIAE in Miami, and she emphasizes this, that researchers, extensionists, and farmers need to be in the room together. They need to be participating together in order to figure out how to balance all of these aspects of agroecosystem management. And some nerds like me will be there saying, hey, the soil food web matters. But then other people in the room need to inform the praxis of what we're doing together. So, I think I'm right on time here with one of my favorite quotes by Aldo Leopold back in the 30s. He said that he was trying to change people's relationship to the land. And I am still, when I talk about regenerative agriculture, this is what I come back to. We have to change human relationships with nature. We have to build up the knowledge base of these communities so that they can have a scientific and a holistic relationship with nature. And, just on time, I have to say, last slide, let's collaborate. Let's collaborate on this. I'm here to make these connections.
Okay, questions?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I appreciate your talk a lot. You started off by sort of indicating that tensions in the room, tensions around these different paradigms. And I just like the name thing because I think it really helps us kind of move forward. I personally don't think those tensions should be there necessarily because I think we have to acknowledge that these are opportunities for more engaged praxis in our field. And so I would be curious to hear from your perspective based on what you share with us and your experiences in your work thus far, and perhaps others could even chime in, what you hope for when you say, like, how can we integrate with better praxis? Because I agree. I'm just curious what you think about when you think about praxis, what kind of better praxis would that look like?
What kind of nutrient management are we going to teach a community they need to do to optimize their agroecosystem? If we take them and a nutrient management regime similar to what we have in the US, I think it's going to fail. I think it's going to fail for lots of reasons economically, and it's also failing biologically because when we put ammonium nitrate on our soils, it's a salt, and it can hurt certain organisms in the soil food web. And so, to me, the danger there is to say, well, those organisms don't matter, right? And that reductionist kind of mentality can come in. And so, what is science except for us trying to improve our models of reality, right, together? And so I bump up against other people's model of reality and have to bring data and evidence to bear and other reasonable argumentation. But I have to tell you, those two communities don't think there's a middle ground often. There's an activist element within my field that doesn't even want to talk with Dow Chemical, but I have friends that work for Dow, and so I'm like, we need to talk together, right? We need to get these big personalities in a room and say, what is again, it's not always an average, it's a mosaic. What are the pieces that will work there? And this is where I'm hoping that if we're bringing the social scientists in the equation, then they can say, what works? What works over time? What does the community respond to? What diffuses? Why did it diffuse? And that helps us identify what elements of agroecosystem management can be integrated.
I appreciate that. I was going to comment back. Like, I think part of the issue, I think the opportunity for social scientists, but most of us in the room, is that it's not just the way we do our science, it's the way we actually engage in the research. I think a lot less even perhaps think about how if you're going to have those collaborative opportunities to engage, maybe we think about our research differently as well. Not just the traditional technical, rational, isolated ways in which we do research. I mean, we actually need to be more dialogic and more engaged and think about those opportunities where people do have a seat at the table. So I appreciate it. I just want to throw that back out to you as well.
Absolutely. And, I think what I have seen is actually, I would put more of the failure on the STEM side. Many of my colleagues in bench science think social science is hand waving. That's how they look at it. And then I'm like, make a friend with a social scientist. It's so important. We can find the coolest thing in the lab, and then what are we gonna say? Well, these dumb people didn't accept it, right? No, get a social scientist involved and understand why, how you can change the innovation and the way it's presented, right? Again, going back to Rogers. So yeah, absolutely. Yes?
I don't know whether you mentioned this, but I never got it very correctly. What are some of the ways that you are suggesting that we should adopt in terms of regenerative agriculture? Because of course what you're saying makes a lot of sense. We're thinking about the sustainability, but what are some examples that we can take away from this?
Yeah, I think so there's regenerative principles, and we're fighting about what those are in my group. I think maybe the most codified idea is conservation agriculture that the FAO has brought out there, because the principles that they've said of reduce the disturbance in your farm system, the disturbance of the soil, diversify the cropping system with more kinds of plants and animals, keep the ground covered, things like cover cropping. All of those end up building that soil food web back as well, right? Or it stops when it comes to mycorrhizal fungi, if you till the soil, you're ripping them apart and they bleed to death, right? So I'm not going to tell a farmer, never till. I'm going to say till as little as possible, right? It's up to them. We have to trust that they understand some of the context there, right, of what they're doing. But I'll bring those principles of conservation agriculture into the discussion every time as concrete examples. Yes, please.
So I love this. Thank you so much for sharing. My work also focuses on agroecology, and I found for my dissertation, I studied perceptions of agroecology among international development practitioners, and one of the things I commonly heard was, it can't scale. And I think this speaks to the comment you made, that I think that we could have a dialogue after about, is related to like agroecology needs to better demonstrate its ability to be sufficiently productive or profitable or whatever the metric it is. But the problem with this, and this is going to connect in, is that it's marginalized and it's not funded. And so,
Preaching to the choir.
considering these nested sort of propositions I've just offered, right? We've got like, how does it scale? It can't scale, right? It's not profitable, but nobody wants to fund the research because it challenges the hegemonic control of companies like Dow Chemical. So what's your vision? Like, besides being like, hey, USDA, like, go ahead and do this, like, where do you see on-ramps within the current systems for agroecology? Because if we never allow it to be on the agenda, it'll never be on the agenda.
You're right, and there's a diffuse kind of bias working against it, but there's also specific gatekeepers working against it. And many of them, I'm a product of the land grant system and I love it, but many of them are administering things in the land grant system right now. So a lot of leadership perspective needs to change. But if you want to talk about a low-hanging fruit, there's a farmer that I know personally in Illinois, Adam York, and he has a website about this, and he's scaled up to 11,000 acres himself, and he also works with other producers on 100,000 acres, and he is using such a tiny amount of herbicide and other agrochemicals, and he's using these kinds of biological methods that we're trying to spread. And so that's one example where I can point to the skeptics and say, look into what Adam York is doing. There's some there, right? It's not something you can just dismiss. But ultimately, challenging those paradigms effectively, those operating paradigms in government agencies and universities is a huge first step for me. And it's what I'm, it's another reason I'm here, because I want allies in this.
I just want to offer, I think your lens of viewing it central, that soil is central, is really smart, because one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with agroecology is the political nature of it. And arguably everything is political, but there's something about soil that just feels really approachable.
Yeah,
to all.
yeah. Let's unify over that resilience piece, right? Nobody wants to watch the rest of our soils erode away. I mean, I used to live in Oklahoma, and I told people every year around the world about a land area about half the size of Oklahoma is eroding away. That's not sustained, that's not tenable for us to do for the next 30 years. We won't have anything left. Okay.
Thank you very much. And really quickly, I forgot to mention Willis Ochieng, who was a co-author on my first presentation, and I saw him in the back. So, yeah, I just wanted to thank him for so, the great